Hi everyone, my name is Anisat Akinbani. I'm so excited to be giving a talk today at Techno Day Conference 2022. And the title of my topic is GraphQL API requests with React, Typescript, and GraphQL Code Gen. Here's a brief introduction about myself. I'm a front-end engineer, a technical writer, an open source community builder, and also, an AWS community builder, and an open source contributor. Now, without further ado, let's dive right into the talk. For the sake of my audience, who are probably new to, some of the technologies I mentioned in the topic, I'll be giving a brief description, or should I call it a brief definition of some of the technologies I mentioned right here in the topic. Starting with TypeScript. TypeScript generally is, gaining huge popularity these days, and lots of developers are kind of migrating their project from plain JavaScript to TypeScript. And the essence of TypeScript being used is because it's kind of easy to catch bugs during development rather than having to catch these bugs during production. So it aids debugging process and also, improves kind of like developers' experience. The next is GraphQL API, and GraphQL is a query language for APIs generally. And with GraphQL, developers can kind of make a single request for all the data they need, right, in just one single request. So without having to do an underfetch or overfetch of the data they're kind of requesting for. Okay, unlike in REST APIs whereby when developers want to make a request, for example, they do a get method to get data, or delete to perform delete operation, different kind of method to perform to perform GraphQL to perform a request. So GraphQL is kind of much more easier because you make all your requests in you query for your data in just one single request. And one cool feature about GraphQL is the fact that GraphQL has a type system, which is a schema. And that schema kind of describes the data and the data queries and mutations for the GraphQL API. Now, let me show you what I'm talking about here. We have the GraphQL playground. And then this GraphQL playground generally used to test and just perform some setting query and mutation operations for your GraphQL API. Now I'm using an external API, which is the country's API. Here's the country's API endpoint, and then to write my query, this is the query I'm trying to get from the GraphQL API endpoint. And the query is contains country's name, country's capital, continent, and the continent name. So on the right hand side is my data, where I have a list of countries, several countries. If you want to set limits to the amount of data you can do that right here when you're querying your data. So here we have the schema. I mentioned earlier that the schema GraphQL comes with a type system schema to describe the queries and mutations for our data. So I already queried my data, and here for the schema I have the country name, which is a string. You can see here that we have type details, which is a string. We have the continent, which is of type continent, and the capital, which I queried for, which is also a string. So in the continent, we have type continent of, and then the name having a type of string. So this is what I mean by a type system that GraphQL comes with. So yes, and moving on, I have so GraphQL is really important, as it's really helpful when it comes to getting your type definitions for your APIs. So another thing is for data fetching in React, we can combine what is known as React query with a GraphQL request library, right, to be able to make our GraphQL API request. This can give us a superpower of Apollo client. Apollo client is kind of like popular most times when developers want to make a GraphQL request, GraphQL API request, right? But there's some scenarios whereby we might not want to use everywhere libraries like Apollo client. We just want a lightweight library for our application. So here I will be using React Query coupled with coupled with GraphQL request library to make our GraphQL query request. So now with GraphQL, we can easily fetch data easily because it accepts a function. So now to follow along easily with our talk, you can clone this repository. This is where the code is contained. Here you can just clone the repository and then follow along with the talk. Now, before we dive right into the talk fully, let me show you what we have in our package.json file. In our package.json, we have a couple of dependencies installed. Now, to be able to use GraphQL on our front-end application, we need to install it. So it's GraphQL was installed for the purpose of this example. GraphQL request library was also installed, which is mentioned earlier. React was installed with TypeScript templates, since we are going to be ensuring that our code is kind of bug free. And also we have a couple of other things in our package.json, like this generate script, which will be explained later on in the talk. Also, our dev dependencies will be explained later on in the talk. Now, for our React query instantiation, in the index.txx file, to be able to instantiate your React query, recall that we already installed React query in our application. So to be able to instantiate, recall that we installed React query, right? So to be able to instantiate the React query in our application, we will basically import React query client and query client provider from React query. Then we will wrap up the top level component of our application in between the query client provider. Here we've basically done the instantiation of our React query, like we have it here in the slide. The next thing we have in the slide is the GraphQL request library. I made mention of the fact that GraphQL request library, with GraphQL request library combined with React query can give us the superpowers of Apollo. So to be able to use the GraphQL request library, in the components folder here on the left-hand side, we created a countries.tsx file. In here is where we'll be, performing the API call. So to kind of like instantiate also the GraphQL request library, we would import GraphQL client from GraphQL request. So basically, GraphQL request library accepts a function, right, which accepts an API endpoint. So this is the function that we defined that accepted GraphQL client function, and in here we defined our GraphQL API URL. So that's basically for the GraphQL instantiation, right? The next step for the process here is to do a GraphQL writing of GraphQL queries. Now, for the purpose of our should I call it, a talk? For the purpose of the talk, like the example in the talk, we want to write our queries, right? And to be able to write our queries, a file needs to be created with a .graphql extension. Now, in here, in the source folder of our application, we created a countries.graphql to be able to write queries that will query our API, right? So in here is where we queried to get the list of data we want from our API endpoint, which is the name, the capital, the continent name. Now, this is just basically in here, you can call this anything you want. For example, if you're building an e-commerce application, you can call this query products, for example, or you're building a to-do list application. You can call this query to-dos, right? So, but the most important thing is that this has to be a .GraphQL extension for the purpose of our CodeGen to be able to read this. Now, the next step is to, after writing the queries, is to do a GraphQL Code Generator setup. Now, for the GraphQL Code Gen itself, GraphQL Code Gen helps us to like ensure type safety. Like, I'm using TypeScript for the front end of our application, and every single thing needs to be typed, right? Even our API that we are going to be using in our application. So to be able to like define the right types, it's always advisable to use GraphQL Code Generator, which kind of helps us to auto-generate correct types based on our GraphQL schema, like automatically generate correct types based on our GraphQL schema, and to get fully costumed React hooks for our GraphQL query. Now, for the purpose of this tutorial, we'll be installing a couple of plugins, right? First is the GraphQL Code Gen CLI, which is this CLI will just help us to run our GraphQL Code Gen script, like CLI, a command line interface, right? So this will be able to read our code gen script that we'll be generating later on. Then also, we need to install these plugins, GraphQL Code Gen TypeScript and GraphQL Code Gen TypeScript Operation. This will help us to generate types and also like to help us get our generated types, right? Also, we need to like let GraphQL know that we're using TypeScript React Query plugin. So this will help us to generate custom React Query hooks for our project. So for our tutorial example now, right, we need to like create a codegen.yml file. Now, the purpose of this codegen.yml file is to like tell GraphQL Codegen the basic things we need for our application. So in the schema section, the schema contains the API URL, which is our external GraphQL API that we will be using for this example, which is the country's API. Then this document tells GraphQL that, okay, GraphQL, sorry, 1 second. Okay, so this document tells GraphQL Codegen to locate GraphQL files, right? And in this case, our GraphQL file is the countries.graphql. So like I was saying the other time that you could call this anything you want. You could call it, if you're building an e-commerce application, you could call this a product.graphql. If you're building a to-do list application, you could call this to-dos.graphql. So the purpose of the document is to tell GraphQL Codegen that you should surf through the source folder and look for a file having .graphql extension. Now the generate section defines the file path where the types will be generated once we run a defined GraphQL Codegen script. So here, we will need a generated folder, right? We just want it called generated. And then in here, we'll be like, inside the index.ts file is where we want all of our custom types, custom React query hooks, and the auto-generated types to be inside of this index.ts file. And then the plugins defines the plugins we installed earlier. Then this fetcher function kind of like let GraphQL Codegen know we're using GraphQL request to fetch our data. So that's that for the codegen.yml file. Now, the next step is to kind of like, go to our package.json and add our script, which you saw earlier here. So here, this is basically how to, add your script, just generate, you can call it whatever you want. You can call it, run or start or something. Yeah, we're calling generate, and we're telling GraphQL Codegen to configure the codegen.yml file we created earlier with all of the details. So the next step is to like make the API request. Now, to make our API request, sorry, to make our API request, right, we need to like, okay, in our first, before making our API request, we need to run the generated script, right? We need to run the generated scripts to be able to like help us generate these types. So to do this, once we run this script, it will kind of like auto generate this folder for us. Inside it, we'll have our types generated by GraphQL Code Gen, which is automatic and kind of like save us the stress of having to do this manually, right? So if you notice, it already tells us, oh, import GraphQL client from GraphQL request, because we specified all of this inside our codegen.yml file. And then here we have the country, the type country, and all of the details. And the most important thing is down here, which is the use query, the use countries query hook. Now, this is like, it's similar to the use query hook from React query, but because this is a generated costume type for our application, that's why it's having the use countries query hook. Now, yeah, that's for the index.tx file. Now, to be able to make our API request, we will have to import the countries query and the use countries query in here. This is where the countries query was defined. So you can see T data is telling us the countries query. So that's what we're going to be importing into our application, into our main component, which is countries component, and countries query, also the use countries query hook, which is the main query we need to, fetch our data. So now, if you're very conversant with the use query hook, you will notice that it kind of like takes three parameters, which is the data, loading state, and an error state to possibly catch any errors. So in this use query hook, right, to be able to interact with our countries API, we initially imported the countries query and the use countries query hook generated by GraphQL Code Gen. So what we will do next is to like kind of like loop through our data, right? We loop through our data, the data mentioned here, we loop through it and get our, response data to display the list of country, the capital, and then the continent name. So for the purpose of styling, basically, Tailwind CSS was used for the purpose of this project. So here we've been able to like make our requests just that easy peasy, just by installing the lightweight library and making our API call in just few lines of code. And then we've been able to make our GraphQL API request without having to like install heavyweight library. So the next slide shows how our data is being displayed in the browser. So, I said for the purpose of styling, we use Tailwind CSS. We just added some basic background colors and, display the countries in form of cards. So this is just a basic, very simple example on how to, make GraphQL API request using GraphQL Code Generator to automatically generate our types, Typescript to ensure our application is bug-free, React query, and GraphQL request library to be able to, have the superpower of like Apollo client, and also kind of like perform fetch requests like the way we do with Axios or fetch HTTP client itself. So yes, Thanks for listening. Yes, thanks for listening. If you have any questions, do let me know. You can send me a DM on Twitter, Anisat Akinbani. I'll be so glad to answer your questions. I hope you enjoyed my talk. Yes, see you next time. Bye.